All right. Hi there. I'm Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Some of you know me in a different role. This is going to be our first podcast under the auspices of the AEG. Oh, dear. Hang on a second. I already had a technical issue. You know what happens when you are doing things live? You just kind of have to roll with it. Whenever I was in radio, I was at least able to go to a commercial break. But we're just going to soldier on ahead. Let me tell you why we're doing this podcast. First of all, there are a ton of business issues that I think need to be dealt with in a fulsome way, and so we're going to probably have about an hour and a half today where we can talk through the issues facing our forestry industry. And what caught my attention in particular was a press release that came out earlier in about the middle of April from the Forest Products Association of Canada. What really caught my eye about it was that they had a couple of others who joined them in this joint press release. They were joined by Unifor. Jerry Diaz was quoted in the press release, as well as by our guest Jeff Bromley from the United Steelworkers. Now, let me just share with you, if I could, a bit of the issues so that you understand what it is that they're dealing with. It's, once again, if I could summarize it, and it will be very familiar to those of you who've watched what happened with the campaign against Alberta's oil sands that has been called the tar sands campaign, is it's another example of US-based environmental groups using US-based foundation money in order to take a hit on a Canadian-based industry. So let me just share this with you. So the press release says anti-Canadian resource group shows its true colors, and industry and labor leaders come together to call out this US-based campaign rhetoric. As we know, sustainable forest management is one of the things that Canada is known for. And we're going to talk through a number of the different issues. But over the past few years, the US-based Natural Resources Defense Fund has been one of the few groups that regularly engages in deliberate and dishonest campaigns to discredit Canadian forestry. And it does that while showing no interest in understanding how Canadian forestry works, how local communities and residents engage in forest management planning, and how committed people in Canadian forestry are to sustainability, reconciliation, a net zero carbon economy, and building healthy and resilient forests and forest communities. So we're going to go through now, and let me introduce you to a couple of our guests here today. We have Derek Nybor, and Derek Nybor is with the Forest Products Association of Canada, and we have Jeff Bromley, who is with United Steelworkers Wood Council, and they both join us now to talk through what in the world is going on in the United States. Thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So Derek, let me start off by talking with you, because what is the nature of this campaign? It sounds like they're trying to ban the import of Canadian products, but it's not even just targeted against Canada. They don't want Swedish products either. They don't want products from Finland. If I was to put on the top of my list 3 countries that you don't want to import wood products from, I would not choose those 3. So tell me, why is it that they're targeting us?
Well, yeah, and they've also put us in the same sentence as Malaysia and Indonesia, which is, insulting to every forestry worker across the country. So, listen, it's a typical campaign. It's deliberately mislead, promote, fundraise off it, and in this case, this group has gone to 2 activist legislatures in the U.S., the California State Legislature in Sacramento and the New York State Legislature in Albany, and they've taken the tact of trying to go after state procurement. So it's not an absolute ban or restriction, but it would be on any wood or pulp paper products procured by the California or New York state governments, that they would restrict anything from tropical or boreal forests. So that's what they're trying to do, and it's really important that we all who are involved in this industry stand up.
Well, let me then talk with Jeff a bit, because I think this is what I'm beginning to see more of this, and I'm delighted to see more of this, that the labor movement is aligning with industry in order to have a joint effort in fighting against some of these unfair and targeted campaigns. Tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, why did you decide to get involved in this?
Well, quite frankly, I think that our industry and many of our members' way of earning their living is under attack by, especially our biggest trading partner is the United States, and especially for our wood products, and to have the two state procurement bills that come back that want to limit, in this case, including boreal forest, because all of our forests, for the most part, are northern boreal forests across Canada, across northern Canada. And the fact is that I think that it's more advantageous to my members in terms of helping industry or aligning with industry to ensure that because we do have like-minded interests. We don't always agree at the bargaining table or maybe in other forums, but we certainly agree that a vibrant and robust industry that is free from threats or maybe aligning against those threats is something that we both have in common.
So, Jeff, talk to me a little bit about where you come from. Just give me an idea of the type of work that you do and your market, because I know that you and Derek are in different parts of the country. So tell us a little bit about the state of affairs in BC.
Thanks, and I appreciate that. I'm coming to you from the southeast corner of British Columbia. I'm in Cranbrook, British Columbia, on the traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, and right now I come out of the forest industry. I've been in the forest industry for about just about 27 years now. I've been working for the union full time for the last 9 of those years. And I was representative at the local level in the Kootenays, negotiating contracts for our members, and then moved into this role, a more national role, through just about 3 years ago. But from a forestry standpoint, in terms of BC, it's been a roller coaster ride that I couldn't possibly have predicted, given we had a tough set of bargaining that I walked into about halfway through in 2018 that we managed to get through in the interior, into at the coast. We had a very difficult and long strike that we managed to get through, and then all of a sudden COVID hit, and then and so that's been difficult on everybody, not only obviously our members, but on our industry. But it's been difficult. And then in terms of the industry, we've had this incredible. The industry is historically known for its deep valleys and dizzying highs, but I don't think anybody could have predicted the dizzying high that the industry is now facing or enjoying in terms of the prices for our products. The amounts, it's increased by probably threefold in terms of regular prices. I don't know if you want to go and buy a 2x4 or a sheet of half-inch good one side at the hardware store, but it's going to be probably about $35 for the 2x4, or about $100 for the sheet of plywood. It's not cheap. Good for our members, tough for people doing some rentals. I understand that, but we're really happy for our members and obviously the industry to enjoy some good times for once, because between the environmental pressures that we face out here in BC or across the country, the environmentalist and what I call the more and more radical environmental aspect towards our industry, the pressures of the trade file, not including the softwood lumber file that's been ongoing for the better part of 4 years now, and obviously the things that I mentioned. So it's been a roller coaster ride, and hopefully we can continue to ride some decent times to maybe make the industry a little bit more vibrant ongoing into the future.
Well, Derek, give me your perspective then, as well as what's happening across the rest of the country, because I thought that forestry was under some consolidation, and maybe it is in different parts. I think the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, has said that we're actually in Alberta positioned fairly well because we managed to maintain seamless operations even through COVID in a lot of those plants. But is that the case elsewhere? Is everyone else able to tool up to take advantage of some of the price increases they've seen?
Yeah, so one of the big issues is BC has been hit hard by natural disturbances. A mountain pine beetle chewed up about 65% of the pine trees across BC. That's now since gone through Alberta to the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, and then fires came 2017, 2018. We had some pretty brutal fire seasons, and we've lost in the last 5 years probably 24 mills, Jeff-ish, in terms of mills in BC. That's capacity that we had 5 years ago. That's another reason reason why we've not only have a demand issue on lumber right now, we have a supply issue. And I say to people, listen, that supply issue is rooted in sustainability. And that's what I like to say to these groups, reminding them what we call in our business the annual allowable cut. If as the BC forests were hit hard by pest and fire, it took out a lot of young trees. So that means we can't harvest as much as we used to until that stock grows back. So those are the underpinnings of sustainable forest management in Canada. So I think that's one piece. I also think not only Alberta has potential, but the Prairie, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and in Saskatchewan, indigenous peoples now control 30% of the wood supply in Saskatchewan alone. So you mentioned the reconciliation agenda, and indigenous leaders and communities and people are we in mining kind of leapfrog each other every quarter, it seems, in terms of who employs the biggest number of indigenous peoples. But we are definitely seeing the forest being a huge economic, social recovery opportunity for those communities as well.
Oh, right. Now, I agree. We're all very happy to see an industry doing well and prices going up, and that's going to create more jobs. But let's have a little sympathy for those of us who are going to be building decks and fences this summer. Can you tell us what you're anticipating to happen? I want to get back to the issue of I want to sort of frame out the market so people can understand how bizarre it is that as we're in the middle of this boom and constrictions, the last thing you'd think a government would do would be to limit the number of places they're able to import lumber and these products from. So I just want to understand a little bit more about what's happening in the market. Is this just a temporary price spike, or are we at a point where we've got to hang on and see these prices like this for some time?
Do you want me to start, and then maybe I'll
why don't you?
Yeah, sure. So I think we need to step back as well. And remember, Jeff mentioned the softwood lumber dispute that hit us in 2017. 2018, 2019 were pretty tough for our sector, not only because we lost a lot of mills and a lot of people lost their jobs in BC. We also had really poor markets, not only in lumber but also in pulp and paper segments as well. So the industry we were kind of just turning that corner coming into 2020, and then the pandemic hit. And then what happened on or about March the 13th is our order sheets collapsed. So the retailers and these wholesalers and people buying our lumber, like anybody else, it was kind of organized chaos at that time. What's going to happen? Are my employees going to die? Are there going to be truck drivers to move the logs? Are stores going to be open, et cetera? So I think everybody was trying to figure it out. And by the time we figured it out, we saw, I think, the impact of one of the true tragedies of the pandemic is how vulnerable workers and ethnocultural communities and others seem to be bearing the worst brunt of this financially. And those of us privileged enough to own a home, we weren't going to hockey games, we weren't traveling, we weren't spending, we weren't going out to restaurants, and we were kind of saying, well, maybe I'll fix the deck, or I'm going to fix the bathroom. And so we saw a massive surge, probably hit us in early to mid-May in that home renovation repair market. And then we've been trying to dig out ever since. So that's been one of the, now, I can't be in the business of predicting markets and where prices are going, but I read Bloomberg and, Paul Quinn from RBC and Amir Patel from CIBC, who are good, who get our industry. It seems to be nothing is certain, but it seems to be they are saying that we will go to pre-pandemic levels probably later this year, early next. But I think in this kind of environment, all bets are really off. But that's what a couple of the top analysts are saying.
All right, Jeff, maybe you want to jump in off of that. Derek talking about the difficulty that frontline workers faced on that. What was the adjustment like for your members over the last year?
Well, as Derek spoke about right off the top, the mills shut down for some for a week or two, some for a month, depending on how they were going to react to the pandemic and what that impact was in British Columbia and in Canada. Anyways, in the southern United States, where aren't our members, well, we have a few members down there, but for the most part, the industry was way more impacted in terms of COVID than it was where in Canada's ability to pivot and satisfy the need, and the impact was slow to get in. It's anecdotally, it was slow to get into the more rural regions of the country, in my opinion, and that's where a lot of our mills are located. So the mills were able to run. However, logistical supply chains, getting truck drivers, right? There's already a massive truck driver shortage in the States. Getting the product across the States after the border closed, like those issues. There was a bit of a logistical nightmare, but then as Derek talked about, the supply really, really ramped up. And traditionally, I mean, granted, historically in our industry, we've never seen a peak like this or a spike like this. Traditional prices were right into the 300-400. If 500 was a great price per 1,000 board feet for a commodity price, they spiked into the 700, 800, 900. Last week it was, I think, 1,600. It was bananas. Like the prices are just so high. And historically, our industry has been able to pivot and say, okay, we're going to add a third shift at the mills, a lot of the mills, but you can't do that if you don't have the near-term fiber supply. And so if you don't have the fiber supply, that supply side of the equation doesn't expand to meet the demand. My last go around with my economics professor about 30 years ago, you're going to have that imbalance. So I don't know how much of that is going to be able to be made up. I still, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert in terms of pricing, I think that you're going to see it settle in the end of the year, but I think it's going to be settled still at pretty nominal highs, comparatively speaking, to what it was in the past.
All right. Maybe you can shed some light on this as well. I'm not sure who to direct it to, but why don't I start with Derek? One of the things that I think was confusing for a lot of us is why toilet paper? Why did we run out of that? And why did we run out of Lysol wipes? And can you sort of explain what happens in the industry when there's that kind of disruption? And has that been solved in the long run?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that people are always amazed. Like, we are a really integrated sector, so it's not just about the sawmills that are, processing the logs and making 2x4s to build structures and communities, but it's the residuals, or what could otherwise be wood waste, the chips, the bark, the sawdust that then goes along to the pulp or paper mill or to a biofuel facility. So the issue we had, and remembering, especially BC is kind of ground zero because of the tight, what we would call the tight fiber basket in British Columbia. But when the sawmills stop running, then the chips stop coming. So you had this. So when all those mills went down, March, April, early May, there was a little bit of concern in terms of from a pulp and paper mill, and those who do that further processing to get us to the paper towels and Lysol wipes and others. They were not getting their supply. So it was a bit of a chain reaction impact. It's really fascinating. Like this time last year, I was the toilet paper guy, and now, my neighbors yelling at me over the back fence about lumber, right? It's been a really bizarre last year in our sector for sure.
Well, let me add one more to it, because I think this is important too, because biomass is increasingly looked at as an area to create a renewable type of fuel, at least in a sort of a circular economy type of way. You can plant trees, and then if you burn it, at least you're planting more trees, and then you're recycling the carbon. And so how has that been impacted also? I can only imagine that there must have been some disruption in electricity production as a result of that.
Yeah, there would have been. I don't know offhand how significant it was in terms of disrupting service and the ability to heat homes and whatnot. But I will say this, the biomass piece is another really interesting area. And you talked about at the beginning about we need to be looking, these are all complex issues we're dealing with. And we quite often have these more zero-sum game, very narrow attacks that could have broad impacts. And one of the areas where some groups, are concerned about biomass. So, you're going to be burning trees. That's bad for the environment. Well, no, we're either burning trees that are so small and can't be used and are part of a broader harvest, or we're using that leftover wood waste from the mills to go to the pellet facility. So it is a lot of people here in Ottawa like to talk about the circular economy. Well, listen, like, first of all, paper and recycling is the original circular economy as far as I'm concerned, and we are trying to use that waste. And then you also need to factor in the displacement factor. We're talking to steel mills in Northern Ontario, for example, about how can we use wood waste to lower their carbon impacts as they bridge to a hydrogen strategy, for example. So I think the context matters when we're talking about the decarbonization agenda, and wood residuals can be a really big important part of that.
And Jeff, can you maybe talk about that too? Because I tend to look at the labor movement as being aligned with the environmental movement under the same umbrella in progressive politics in a lot of cases. In the US, it's Democrats. Here, it's sort of liberal NDP. And I'm just wondering how that gets, how those conversations take place, because I look at forestry as being a huge part of the solution on the environmental front. And it must be strange that they're now looking at forestry as being a problem. Can you shed some light on that?
Oh boy. So in terms of the impact, so I want to talk about. Derek talked about the circular part of our industry,
Yeah.
or part about how important our industry is to the overall everyday uses. We talked about the toilet paper issues and stuff. I mean, let's talk about Amazon and how that's how a lot of people get a lot of stuff. Well, those are in boxes and those are in packaging, and that comes from forestry. That's where it comes from, and people need to understand that it all starts with our trees and all starts with our forestry practices and what we do, and that long line of progression in terms of how integrated the industry is. And so those impacts in terms of more Amazon, more, and less supply, those really tighten those things. So that could be to answer your first question about the tightened supplies on that. But in terms of the you couched it and you characterized it as the labor movement are traditionally aligned. I would disagree. Maybe we all agree as an industry that we all the low carbon economy, and I think we all agree for the most part as a society that it's important that we're going in that direction. But we need to make sure that we're going there in the direction that try to mitigate the impact on jobs and impact on communities, etc. And that's where we disagree a lot of times, because we'll have and I'm going to go down this rabbit hole in terms of the environmentalists or the NGOs impact or attacking part of our industry in terms of old growth. And I know that's centered mostly on the west coast of British Columbia, but it's an integrated industry, and we have environmentalists that attack a portion of our industry that say, okay, well, because they're bigger, older trees, that we shouldn't be using them, and that's just such an emotional attachment. And I understand that, and I recognize it, but I think it's wrong, and I think that not enough of the science is used in terms of approaching that. So, in terms of that relationship with the environmental movement and labor, that generalized sort of commented that we're aligned, I would disagree, because from my point of view, represent all forestry, and that's my world. But as steelworkers, as a union, we have steelworkers that make pipe in Regina, that the oil comes out of Alberta, that it flows through. So when those decisions are made, it impacts our members, and we have the steel mills in Hamilton and etc. It's uber impactful when the environmental movement decides to turn on certain portions without knowing the impact, and so I think that it's not a good relationship right now. We like to say maybe that we're on the from the political spectrum, perhaps that maybe they're close, but on an issue by issue, there's many, if not all, that we do not agree.
All right. Well, let me ask you the question in a bit of a different way, is that if you're making the argument about the practices on the ground, because you see them, you were in the industry for 27 years. So Jeff, tell me what you would observe were some of the major milestones in moving towards a sustainable forestry industry. Have we always been great, or were there some problems in the past and we've corrected them? Or are there some issues we still need to work on? How do you see it?
I can start with in 1994 when I got into the industry. You go through, the first thing you see, that it's a sawmill. What do you see? A beehive burner. There were big burners, and you'd see the residuals, a lot of residuals being burned instead of being used.
Jeff, I must tell you that I go to Sicamous to my parents' trailer, and they've got a burner restaurant there, and it's wonderful. I wish that there were actually more of those retired burners that would be turned into that. So I know exactly what you're talking about, but please continue.
Exactly. But that's one of the first steps in terms of a more integrated industry, but B, we don't burn waste anymore. We use 100% of the resource. And so that would be one of the ways that our industry has really pivoted 30 years ago in terms of using that waste for power generation, for biofuels, for more you can use for the creation of particle board or more products and stuff like that, rather than just taking the timber and the chips, making lumber and making pulp, but you make more products out of it. And the other thing that more recently is the switch to try and bring more value at it, to try and create more products out of value-added products such as mass timber, and things that the industry is trying to pivot to it's going to take time. I mean, as much as some governments, BC, it's the catchphrase mass timber, and it's great, and it's a great product to produce. But there's markets need to be developed for that. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's coming. And I think those are two good examples of how the industry has pivoted and recognized that we can, and then ultimately the carbon and how our industry stores carbon and how it always has, in my opinion. I'm in a building made mostly of wood. It was made approximately 45 years ago, I think it was built in, and that carbon is still in the wood that was used to construct this. That when the wood was taken out of the forest, so that carbon's still here. It's not gone anywhere. It's not in the atmosphere.
Derek, layer on top of that, because you must have some other examples from what you've seen, because I think there's almost this sense among environmental groups is that if they didn't push and they didn't regulate, then the industry wouldn't respond. And so maybe the environmental movement has been very productive and proactive and positive in some cases, but are they kind of not recognizing the strides that you've made? And how would you answer that?
Yeah, so I'd start by saying that I always get I don't say nervous, but I'm always very careful when I use the words activists or environmental groups, because I consider myself to be an activist, especially during COVID when I saw what was happening in our long-term care homes here in Ontario and the poor response to some of these hot, red zone neighborhoods who we couldn't get vaccines to these people. So I'm always really careful. And when it comes to environmental groups, I will say that they're not all the same. So we do a lot of work we have a great partnership with Earth Rangers here in terms of educating young Canadians. We do work, regular check-ins with WWF Canada on a host of issues. Our companies do on the ground work with Ducks Unlimited and Nature Conservancy. So, but there are other groups like this one in the US who it's about sensationalism and fundraising. And if you do any historical review on that specific group, they've been doing this for decades. This is the business model. So I think that's an important qualifier. I will say, in terms of the history of this sector in Canada, there were sins for which atonement was due. I think we need to call that out very clearly. Some of the practices that were happening in the 70s, 80s, into the early 90s during the War of the Woods were completely unacceptable. We actually saw there was an ENGO report criticizing or suggesting that a forest in northwestern Ontario wasn't properly managed and that there were these legacy scars and whatnot on the land base. Well, they're right, but it was a forest management. It was a harvest from 30 some years ago. And it's good that was, because now that's being amended, but at the same time, that's not forestry today. And I think what came out of that experience and what came out of being pushed by those environmental groups was, reformed government regulation and legislation and policies. It brought about third-party certification to Canada. That was the period. All of our FPAC members above the federal and provincial laws that they operate under have third-party independent certification on top of that. And that's a Canadian success story. Like only 11% of the world's forests are third-party certified, and Canada has almost half of them. So it's an incredible story, and I think that story has been forgotten. I also think that we are moving into, there's massive societal change. Me Too, BLM. There's a lot changing around us. The world is changing, and I would say in markets, read Mark Carney's book Values or follow the ESG space. And their certification is absolutely critical, but we're in a kind of a certification plus environment now for sure. And that's the carbon space, that's the biodiversity space, and I think I welcome difficult conversations with environmental groups. I welcome a discussion about the facts and the science. I like getting reports that are constructively critical. We have to embrace that in Canada, but you draw the line for these groups who aren't interested in a dialogue. They're interested in they're interested in gotcha kind of plays, and that's where I draw the line between those groups.
So what is it that they're actually saying about our industry? Maybe I'll start with you, Jeff. Give me an idea of what this group is. You said if you look them up, you'll see that this is kind of a pattern for them. So Natural Resources Defense Council, what is it that they are taking umbrage with Canada and Sweden and Finland? Why are we in their eyesights?
Well, I think that the first one I'd go after, besides the fact that their bills talk about the boreal forest, which is a huge umbrella or blanket being thrown over our forest industry, and how we can, I think more particularly is that, and Derek mentioned off the top about the certification standards, FSC, and but they've actually chosen to attack one of the certification standards in their latest, I've read, SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, of which I am a board member. So total transparency, but SFI is they chosen to attack it as saying it's not stringent enough, it's not this, it's not that. So even when we do the right thing, they find ways to pick apart that rather than more of a conducive way of dealing with any issues they made. They want to do, as Derek mentioned, the sensationalistic trying to reaction gotcha fundraising moment that really gets, I appreciate Derek's response about, he seems really calculated. Me, I get emotional about it, and it's to my own fault, but because I feel attacked. As no difference as if I was trying to go to work and earn a living and pay my mortgage and all that fun stuff, and then somebody was standing in front of me and says you can't go to work for no other reason other than they disagreed with what we produced. And I don't think that that's the way to do it. And I think that there's better ways, better processes to deal with the issues that our industry has, and ENGOs and things like the Flying Rainforest Squad that you see down at the coast and things like that. They'd rather do the sensationalist stuff that really attacks really my members, workers, our industry, and just attacks it rather than trying to really get together and talk about the science and talk about the facts.
Well, let me talk about that because I got a question here from Morris, and maybe this gets at the heart of it. Are wood emissions more harmful than oil emissions? I don't know if you saw the movie Planet of the Humans, but they really did take quite a run at the biomass industry. And I'm wondering if that's part of what's behind this latest effort, is they're trying to recast forestry in a different light and only look at one side of the equation as opposed to the carbon capture side of the equation. Are you able to respond to that?
In terms of I haven't seen the movie, so
okay. Derek, have you seen the movie?
Comment.
No, I've heard about the movie. I have, and I think the thing I always, when I talk to people about biomass, and once again, it gets back to the value chain, and because what is the alternative? And I think that's what we're not talking about. I want to, when I think about this campaign against Canadian boreal sourcing, I say, want it from the Amazon or 10 hours outside of Russia. Because, if you do, let's now talk about human rights. Let's talk about family supporting wages. Let's talk about the fair treatment of women, LGBTQ2 people. Like, let's go there. Let's go there. It's no different, I would say, in the biomass space, because what is the alternative? The alternative is to have this stuff pile up and then be a risk for a forest fire. And now let's talk about that carbon impact. So I think it's so important, and we're really, I think, poorly served just in this era of information overload and social media, where we're not having those discussions, and everything is binary, and that's zero sum game. And I think that's the biggest. I find for me in my job, we want to do good work. The people who work in our sector, like my grandpa, my dad, who spent their careers there, they hunted in the community, they fished in the community, they lived there, they hiked, they snowshoed, they skied. They want good things by the environment and the land base in their communities. And I think, I'm like Jeff, I grew up in I come from there. So I have to hold myself back because you don't want to be too emotional about it. But I also remember I remember my brother and I were 10 and 11 when my dad lost his job. And I remember what that was like. A couple Christmases were pretty tough. And I remember not being able to go to the dentist for a couple years, and the humiliation and the strain on my parents' marriage. So I feel I carry that with me in this job today. And I don't want, if we can keep just one more mill open and keep these people working to avoid that real experience that I saw as a kid, that keeps me going.
All right, Jeff, talk about that too, because I think that is one of our comparative advantages, is that these are well-paying jobs in an industry that does care about health and safety and does care about the work environment. Would you echo what Derek's saying?
Oh, many, many times over. In terms of my own experience, my stepfather, 30 years in the industry. My grandfather worked at the same mill at Canal Flats just before the war, World War II, for a couple of years before he went off to war. I mean, it's a long history in my family as well, and the industry gets into your blood. My son worked his first shutdown. He was saving for college at the local pulp mill just up the road from here. He's saving for university. He's going to university in September. So it's part of the fabric within many of our rural communities in many parts of, whether you're going, whether you're in Prince George or in Hinton or up at High Level or in Prince Albert. I mean, or across the way, Ottawa was it's a forestry valley. I mean, it's a fabric of our country, and it gets into your blood in terms of how defensive you get on it. But in terms of what bothers me to your point about the recent attack, or the more the pivot to attack the biofuel part of the industry, or the wood pellet. Let's talk about wood pellet stuff like that seems to be the flavor of the day. Our intent, I think the industry's intent is to certainly get the most value out of the product. If you can make a good 2x4 or make a product, more value added product out of that, you're going to do that. If the products that you cannot make, and then it's a waste product, and you're into the wood pellets and burning for biofuels, it's it's an alternative energy producer. We talk about that we can't. The environmentalists don't want us to burn oil. They don't want us to burn gas. They don't want us to burn wood. Well, where are they getting? They say, okay, let's go to solar or go into wind. Well, I know where some of the materials coming out of the solar panels are coming from, and those mines, and the materials they needed to make those, and if they dug into them, they probably wouldn't like that either. And as much as I'm a supporter of wind energy as well, because my members in the steel part of the industry in the sector make those big turbines, so that's a good thing too. But that comes from steel, which comes from coal, which is dug just down the street from me in the Elk Valley here. We got 3 big coal mines that metallurgical coal. So at what point we got to try to do our best as all industries to try and make sure that to lower our carbon imprint. But from a forestry standpoint, most of our industry, I'd probably argue 90 to 95% of it is rural, and it is not in the major industrial centers of our country anymore. And so there's a bit of a disconnect, it seems like, between, and I'm not trying to cop out and say, oh, the rural urban divide, but there is a bit of a disconnect. There is only so many jobs that we can do. And we're a resource-based economy in many locations across our country, in these small areas, these small communities, and they survive on it. And when there's a closure, it's devastating. I watched that mill in Canal Flats in 2015 close, and the devastation it caused in that small little community. Since I've been in this position, and Derek mentioned 20 plus mills closed in the last 3 years. There were 8 of our mills, USW mills, not including Unifor or other unions or non-union mills that have closed. There were 1,000 of my members that lost their jobs in a span of 18 months. It's impactful.
Let's talk a bit about that urban-rural divide, because I think, Jeff, you've really touched on the big divide, because it strikes me that in an urban environment, there is kind of an expectation that we can get to net zero or absolute zero by 2050, I think is the target, but it keeps on moving up to 2030. And if you look at 2030, my gosh, that's only 9 years away. And so I'm wondering how we get a more realistic message out to an urban audience. I think you're right that rural, maybe because we're working in it, they can see it firsthand. They know the practices have changed. So I think that education may be a little bit easier in the rural environment. But Derek, what do we do to convince folks in Toronto and Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, and Montreal that this is an industry that is doing things the way they can be proud of?
I think we try to find relevant ways to connect with them. I tried to use that, that crazy story about toilet paper surges in a way to connect with media in Toronto and Montreal and Halifax, to talk about what's happening. How does our supply chain work? What are we about? The same with the lumber price thing. It's an opportunity to talk about, listen, yes, this is, if you're building a deck next week, this is not going to be great for your budget, but let's understand about how the supply works, how we manage to keep forests as forests forever, how integrated the industry is. I'd also say that, kind of the pandemic aside, the other areas I'm finding we can connect with urbanites on forestry is the growing business of urban forests. And, like, we're seeing a lot of talk about tree planting and, urban conservation groups who are doing things. Well, the same principles align. Those trees don't live forever. They're subject to getting attacked by, ash borer or whatever pest is in your area. The other area, I would say, in an even more positive and beautiful way is, and we see it a lot in Vancouver and we see it in Edmonton, in terms of wood building structures and building taller with wood. And not only the carbon benefits, and not only they can almost go up like Legos now with cross-laminated timber. So you have fewer trucks going on site, not as many, the neighborhood's not as disrupted. Plus, it's friggin' beautiful. Like, people love these wood buildings, right? So, from our perspective anyway, I think you really just you try to find those opportunities to connect at a time that's relevant. And I think toilet paper, lumber, urban forest, and tall wood buildings give us that opportunity.
All right. Let me talk a little bit then more about the issue of net zero and what it means for your industry and how to get there. So For one thing, Jeff, let's talk about the issue. You've raised this a couple of times that boreal forest is different than old growth and it's different than tropical. And I think Derek also just talked about trees have a life, sort of a natural lifespan. And I think maybe we can explore that a little bit so that we understand that once you've planted a tree, it doesn't mean it can last forever. I think that maybe the old growth issue has us believing that that's how all of our forests are, that they can last for hundreds of years. Can you shed some light on that, Jeff?
Well, and that's the beauty of our industry, and not to take away from any other the other industries, is that it's circular. It's a renewable industry. We can, and yes, it takes 20 or 30 or 40 years to get a good second growth tree, but in terms of harvesting, but it may even need longer than that. But in terms of old growth, at some point, yes, we have these big giants and stuff that last centuries, and we're not taking those ones that are those ones aren't, they're protected. There's various legislation and various policies that company use in terms of, but they just the approach is that there was no old growth. So and I think they get lumped in with, and they don't think about in terms of what the impact would be on. So if you take away from one part of the equation, it's going to put more pressure on the other side of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's follow that logic through. So let's say we ban old growth. That's it. We can't, if it follows the definition, whether it be, I'll use the BC definition, 250 or 240 years old on the coast, or 100 and I believe 80 or 160 years old in the interior. So if you take that, so then we talked about supply demand and value annual allowable cut. So where's that cut going to come from? It's going to come from more second growth. That's going to put more pressure on the second growth. It's going to put more pressure on the cycle when that second growth is produced. It needs to be it's a balanced approach is always the best way. And so I think that in terms of your question, they don't look at the overarching picture of what attacking one part of the industry would have on other parts of the industry. I mean, I can't speak for the tropical part of it. Derek's mentioned it before about human rights issues and etc. because that's not my world. But and the boreal and the old growth is my world, and I know that if you cut one off and without following the science and really looking at the socioeconomic impacts, you're going to have it's going to manifest itself somewhere else, and that's going to be the impact on the rest of the boreal forest for sure.
Can you talk about that, Derek? Because I guess I always thought that you had this great agreement with the environmental community, the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement. So I thought that there was some understanding that the boreal forest could be managed in the way that you're doing it. So we'll talk about how that agreement broke down. But first, let's understand the distinction here, because I know that's one of your big asks at the end, is for us to get a little bit more specific about what it is that they're trying to target. What is the difference with boreal forest versus tropical? Why is it inappropriate for them to be targeting it?
Yeah, so stepping back, the boreal forest in Canada, 70% of our boreal forest is unmanaged. We don't harvest. We're only operating on 30% of the boreal forest. So there's a depending on the part of the country you're in, there's a northern cut line that is just forest, and that's untouched, unmanaged forest. The issue is, if you bring this back to the value of carbon, the most recent State of Canada's Forest Report, which is what Natural Resources Canada puts out every year, I think we're the only country in the world that does an annual report explaining what's been happening in our forests, how much has burned, how much has been attacked by pests, how much has been harvested, how much has been replanted. That report that comes out annually from NRCan shows that right now 25 times the amount of trees that we're harvesting are annually being burnt by fires or pests. So and not only that, on the carbon equation, the managed forest is a carbon sink of 8 megatons. The unmanaged forest is a carbon source of 251. So my challenge back to some of these groups is we need to look at what the serious carbon story is, and in Canada, it's worsening pest outbreaks and fires. And I think if you do look at that whole value chain opportunity and those full value chain solutions in forestry, our boots on the ground are absolutely critical. So I think that's often forgotten. There's a significant, the majority of the boreal has no forestry activity at all, and the part that does, the carbon story is pretty darn good.
Well, this is what I wonder, if there's a need for us to shift entirely in how we manage our forests. Because if it is the case, as Jeff sort of alluded to, that the natural life of a stand of trees might be in the 160-year range, does it even make sense for us to have 70% of our forests that are off limits to any type of management, knowing that you're going to end up with natural fires and pests that are going to end up exacerbating the problem. I don't know, maybe this is a can of worms, Jeff, to open up, but wouldn't it make more sense to put it all under management and take a 200-year time scale on every part of the forestry industry and just cycle through where you allow cut and where you allow growth? Or am I just barking up the wrong tree here?
I think that you'd have to take on the economic part of the equation then too, in terms of industry, because as we all know, our country is massive, and the parts where Derek alludes to in terms of the boreal forest that isn't even managed, there a lot of them are. They're not economically viable to harvest in terms of being able to get them to any manufacturing facility. For I believe one. I mean, that's the easy answer. And there's not communities in these places that are there to house workers and house facilities and the support mechanisms to have an industry that would justify managing them. That is the relationship where those managed forests are in relations to communities, right? So I think that's probably the easy answer. To do a massive shift and put it all under management, that's probably a bigger question that I'm able to answer in terms of government regulation, in terms of industry participation, etc. I think that's probably something that it would have already been approached right now if it was feasible.
That makes sense. Derek, are you satisfied? Does Jeff raise all the right points about why it is we wouldn't be able to put everything under management? Is there something I'm not considering there?
Yeah, no, I think the economics do need to make sense. The will and the wishes of local communities need to make sense too, right? Like I think that's what this is all about. This is about community-based planning, and that's local municipalities, recreation clubs, indigenous communities. And that's the fundamental. I say to my urban friends, it's no different than a rezoning a new condo on your block, right? I mean, like what material is it going to be? How high is it going to be? How many levels of parking? Like these are important, and there are going to be differences of opinions about that. But it's the job to take all of those wishes and values and insights and develop the best plan that works for that neighborhood or community. And forest management is no different. I think we are seeing talk in Alberta, Ontario about ways how can we get more out of our forests in a sustainable way. I know Minister Dreeshen in Alberta has been doing that. I know Minister Yakubuski in Ontario also is looking at that. And for us, it needs to be rooted in those principles of sustainability and biodiversity. That's where it starts.
Let's then talk about, because this is again why I'm a bit surprised at the targeted attack, because everybody is celebrating the tree planting efforts of your industry. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he wanted to target to plant 2 billion trees, and when someone went to do a recent update on that, it doesn't sound like there's been much progress at the federal level. But in Alberta, there was a press release saying I think your members had planted 86 million trees. So your industry are the ones who are on the ground and actually making the effort and making the progress in tree planting. So give me some sense of what it would take to meet the Prime Minister's target of planting 2 billion trees. Can they even do that without you, Derek?
Well, they can't do it without our advice. I would say we're part of it. We're just one part of a network with the nurseries and the silviculture companies and a number of indigenous communities and others who are really experts in tree planting. And you can't just decide I'm going to plant 2 billion trees. The advice we had given to the government was, number one, you need to make sure you don't jam the nurseries, because we plant up to 600 million our own every year in terms of that commitment to renewal and sustainability. So the last thing we wanted to see was them jam the nurseries, and then we can't meet our obligations in terms of replanting and replacing what we take. That's just one. The other part is, in a changing climate, do your homework to make sure you're planting the right trees in the right places. Because, we want them to be resilient for fire and pests, and you don't want to plant a tree somewhere that's going to die in 5 years. Also, the sequencing in terms of accessing the labor pool, you got to think about that. This is hard manual work that needs to be done. So there's a lot of indicators, and I think government's been pretty inclusive. There's, I was during one of the negotiations or discussions on 2 billion trees, there was one group that was saying, I can't even remember who they were, but they were saying, well, we must plant a tree, but promise never to harvest it. Well, it's going to die. Like, and I understand. Listen, there are some places in urban centers, and there's a huge opportunity to cover for more forest cover in our urban centers. But there are also parts of the province, I think in BC and Alberta, that have been hit hard by fire. When we harvest, we replace what we take. If a natural disturbance scorches the earth, that's left up to the goodwill of the provincial government to invest in tree planting or for natural regeneration, which in some parts of the country isn't happening because the fires are burning so hot. So what we've said to the government as well in this regard is, listen, work with provincial governments to find out where these scorched lands are in the more northern forests, and let's replant them. And you know what? In 80 to 100 years, we should be harvesting them. So, anyway, lots of work, not easier said than done, I'd say, and hopefully they're going to get it right.
Jeff, do your members do that tree planting? I remember when I was in university, one of the people I used to hang out with, that was her summer job, that she would go and plant trees. And my gosh, it's hard work. So I don't know if that's something that the summer students do, or do your members do the tree planting too?
We do have some of our sectors that do have the silviculture and the nursery part of it. It's not the majority part of it, but we are involved in some of the sectors. But you're right. That is backbreaking work. You're climbing up some pretty. Not only are you climbing up some pretty rocky territory, and you're in the middle of up valleys and draws and planting. There's grizzlies and bears and all sorts of things that they have to be prepared for, and it's not easy work. And to your comment about the Prime Minister's statement about 2 million trees, I'll be honest with you, it was a little irresponsible. And I guess it gets a flashy, if that's what you're looking to get some press on how green you're going, and the intent is there, but you didn't think this through. I mean, in terms of what the application to get it done is actually going to take. It's just, and it's irresponsible. Like, again, it's politics and whatever. I guess you have to say what you're going to say, but if you're not going to live up to it, why say it then? Or if it's such a lofty goal, then why bother? I mean, it doesn't have any substance, and it's unfortunate because it's, and I'll give you one good example, or two good examples on the ground, boots on the ground examples, as Derek was mentioning, in terms of regeneration. If you take a drive up from where I am in southeastern BC and head towards where you are, I believe you're in Calgary?
Yeah, I'm just south of Calgary.
So if you head towards Calgary from here and you go through the Banff National Park, there's a massive fire that was over the last few years. And there's a couple of different examples of it, of different fires, and that is regeneration is struggling. It's not happening as well as it has. If you go west and take the Highway 3 all the way through down between Princeton and Hope, and the Manning Park there, just before the park, there was a beetle kill. It was harvested in the mid 80s, just when I graduated, 87, high school, and it's now a fully regenerated forest, and they can almost start second growth harvesting on that area. Again, they haven't yet at this point, but that's just an example of our industry. Yes, we harvest, but we replant, and industry does a massive amount of replanting, and they have to by regulation in most jurisdictions, and B, it makes complete sense if you want your industry and your business to last longer than a generation. And if you don't want it to last longer than a generation, well, don't replant, and then you'll be out of business.
Okay, Jeff, we've been getting along so well. I'm worried that my next question is going to cause some disagreement, but I'm going to say it. I'm going to ask you anyway. One of the things that I've heard about is the potential of using drone technology to do planting. And now I recognize that means that you might not have the same amount of jobs on planting, but I guess the encouraging side is that you need someone to operate those drones, and they might be able to be more effective in planting a large number of seedlings at once. I think they're trying this as a pilot project after the Slave Lake fire, where they just take a drone up, and then they're able to shoot these little pellets, these little seedlings into the soil, and hopefully some of it takes. Would you have any opposition for us looking at some of those types of ways of being able to improve planting, or am I again sort of delving into an area where we're going to get some disagreement?
No, and unfortunately, I guess there's going to be some point we're going to disagree, but I'm just being realistic, and I'll be honest with you. I haven't seen this technology and how you're going to shoot a seedling, because I've done planting, and it's, like I said, it's backbreaking work. There's a tool that you use to dig it down, take the seedling out of the pot and put it in, make sure it's there, and you step on it and move on. So I'm really interested to see how they're shooting seedlings, and how that's going to operate, and is it going to be as efficient? So I really have to look at it. But listen, when I when my grandfather got in the industry and my father was working, my stepfather was working in the industry, there was probably 60 people working per shift. There's a green chain. You were pulling stuff off by hand. Now those same mills and those same shifts are run by technology. Of about 15 people per shift. Like it's unfortunate, and I'd love to have hundreds of jobs, but sometimes technology, it takes some impact, but it certainly takes some adjustment. And our industry has been nimble enough to adjust to those things. And I think that I'd have to look at it, but I don't look at it. I'd like to see how. That's a lot of drones, to be honest with you.
It would be. Let me see if Derek has a thought on that. Maybe the reason I did a segment on this a couple of years ago, maybe the reason I haven't heard more about it is that the experiment failed. Derek, is there any promise in that as a potential? Because there are, as you point out, if there are vast areas that are not being managed, they are remote, it's creating this problem of pushing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If there's a way that the forestry industry could solve this with new technology and more efficient planting in some of these remote areas, then that seems to be a win all the way around. Is there any promise there?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there's still a ways to go in terms of advancing the technology, but I also say beyond that, even in our business, LiDAR, it's kind of like a radar technology that really allows you almost like to get a view of the forest and better identify where birds' nests are or bears' dens are. Like, I mean, there's a lot of new technology, and that's why also a broadband strategy, because we tend to be more rural and remote, right? So a lot of those technologies do need to be supported by better broadband access. So we're really keen to see the federal government get moving on some of that, so we can advance some of those technologies.
Is there anything else you can tell us about technology of what to look forward? I've been talking to a lot of folks, and I think Jeff made reference to it, that wind is not truly going to be zero emissions until the transportation to get all those turbines to the site are zero emissions, until the cement used to put them into the ground are zero emissions, until the steel used to create them in the first place are zero emissions. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of capture technology that you're using in biomass or in any of the operations that you have where on the carbon emission producing side that we should be paying attention to? Is there any way that you can mitigate some of those emissions?
Yeah, I think some of them we've done. So our, we were an early adopter on this move to lower GHGs. Like our GHGs at our mills are down almost 70% since the early 90s. Like there was a lot of move, and we're seeing some really cool things too. There's in Saint Félicien, Quebec, there's a cucumber greenhouse, a massive cucumber greenhouse that is powered by waste heat from the Resolute Forest Products pulp mill. So that's a capture technology whereby waste heat is being used to power this greenhouse, and it's a massive a cucumber facility, and we are seeing more of that happening. We're seeing mills that are looking at plans to be fossil fuel free. I'd say the other thing where innovation, it's not only on the mill side, but it's what can we do on the product side to further create lower carbon options, right? I think there's huge opportunity, and the most recent example, which is more of a health attribute and health option, is with the support of funding from the federal government and researchers at FP Innovations, which is kind of a private public think tank in the forest innovation space, we've developed the first of its kind in the world 100% biodegradable mask made from Canadian wood fiber. So to replace some of those plastic masks that we might see on the sidewalks and the side of the road. So the innovation's happening at the mill level. I think there's this new fund out of the Old Industry Canada. I think it's $5 billion over 7 years for the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. So there's I think all of mining, energy, all of us are looking at these new funding programs and whatnot to support decarbonization. And I see that opportunity at our mills, but I also see innovation opportunities we talked about in the forest, but also through making some pretty cool products.
All right. Jeff, anything to report on in BC that you're seeing on that kind of innovation front?
In terms of it's been stuff we've been doing for a long time. In terms of the boilers that have been from the pulp mills that are using the residuals, as I spoke for before, in terms of them using the residuals, we call it hog fuel, which is the bark, and using those residuals instead of burning them and turning them into power. We've been doing that for quite a long time, and I think that would be the best example that's and I think it's an example of how our industry has been a leader in terms of before, as Derek said, that GHG was cool to be, carbon neutral or attempting to get there. I think that we've always, for a good period of our time, the last 30 years especially, has been a direction that the industry as a whole has been trying to achieve.
Let me ask you about what you're facing from an attraction of labor point of view, because I want to argue it from the other side. It seems to me like there is additional opportunity in this area, especially as we start looking at ways in which forestry can help replenish the landscapes. And I'm wondering, are you facing any difficulty attracting enough workers into the space? Maybe I'll start with Jeff on that. If you had a young person who was thinking of a career, is going into the forestry industry, is that going to be a lifelong career, or are there just so many hits coming against the industry from the environmental groups that they're trying to shut it down, that the opportunities aren't what they once were? How do you see it?
I think that the opportunities are there, and I think it's more of a generational shift. As I spoke before, there used to be 60 people per shift, so there are lots of jobs in those days. You could go mill to mill to mill. There was a mill just down the street or another down the highway you could always go to. Now that's not the case. There's only so many mills around, and B, it's not the younger generation. And I've got two boys that are 25 and 22 that that are going to university and stuff, but are that I teach them about my industry, and one of them has actually worked in the industry, is trying to really wrap their head around what we do. And it's something that we have to sell ourselves in terms of young people, if they want to get into there's fascinating advances and fascinating opportunities. But just from a worker standpoint, if that's what you choose to do, or if that's what we end up doing, I was 30 at university and I was coming back to make some money, and this is where I am. So I didn't end up finishing my degree, but you end up, and it gets into your blood. But in terms of attraction, and I know specifically from the forestry sector on the harvesting side, where the industry is having a great, in BC anyways, is having a great deal of difficulty attracting operators, attracting people to work in the industry. And whether it's not cool to do so, or it's just not, it's because the wages are good, the benefits are good. I mean, and your office is, you're out in the great outdoors. It's not, there is some advantages, but there has been struggles to attract. And I'm even now, where there was in the mills, there was always lineups to get these jobs, and it was hard to get because they were good family supporting paying jobs. Not so much anymore. I know that my mill, I come out of the Canfor mill just down the road here, and you could push in a resume and hire you. They're always running short. They're short people, and the industry there is a shortage. Is it acute or more anecdotal? It's hard to comment on, but there is more of a shortage now than there ever was.
Derek, can you talk a bit more about that too? Just so you know, I'm in the process of trying to put together a board of directors so that we can create a trades charter school in Alberta. So I'm very interested in making sure that young kids in grade 10, 11, and 12 understand where the opportunities are, because there's amazing work that can be done in some of the trades that can go on to ultimately start their own business potentially, or work in a mill where there's actually quite a bit of technology. I mean, that was one of the big surprises that I had when I went up and toured in the Whitecourt area. So I've been to a lumber mill, OSB plant, as well as a pulp mill. And so much of it is run by technology. And it's so precise to see the boards going through and turned in a certain way just so that they can get the maximum amount of board feet out of it. It's remarkable. I mean, you almost do need to have, I think, some pretty high tech skills in order to do some of those jobs. And maybe young people don't know how the job has changed. So why don't you tell us where the opportunity might be when we look forward?
Yeah, well, and first of all, I'd be happy to talk offline to help you with that, because I know our friends at the Alberta Forest Products Association do some work with a great group called Inside Education. They've got a program called Work Wild that does a lot of outreach into schools across Alberta. There's another really good program. It's called the Outland Youth Employment Program, and it's targeted towards Indigenous youth to let them know what opportunity is there for them. And I think that's one of the biggest things. I think, we often say in our sector now that we have as many white lab coats as we do orange safety vests. You couldn't say that 10 years, 20 years ago. And so I think it becomes important. People need to see themselves. They need to see themselves in terms of, I didn't know that kind of job existed in that sector. If for women, they need to see other women who've done well in forestry so they can see themselves there. I think of, when I'm driving up home north of Ottawa here, how many in some of these rural communities, new Canadians who are here who were not here before, how do they see themselves? And then the Indigenous youth pool is just a huge talent pipeline for the future for all natural resources sectors, I would say. And we're all trying to find a way. How do you link with those community leaders? How do you link with those schools to provide those opportunities? So the jobs are there. Listen, 230,000 people, and we're about a 3-to-1 indirect job. So that, we're just under 1 million people in Canada. That's a pretty significant industry still. We've got an aging workforce. The labor force is changing. But anyway, I'm glad to hear you. I think that's a really great initiative, and we'd be happy to help.
I guess this is why I get so frustrated when I hear these campaigns against our industry, because you've got young people who are impressionable. And when you've got a young person and they're trying to think of a career opportunity, they want to be proud of the work that they do. And they don't want to feel like they're going into an industry that's going to hurt the environment. And that's why I think it's so important what you both are doing to fight back against these messages that are coming that are dishonest and deceitful. So let's go through a couple of the things that you're trying to get out there. Because one of the things that I think is really important, you've mentioned all of the great jobs that are available in the Canadian sector, 230,000, 600 communities. So it's not even like you have to necessarily go that far to find a job in forestry. In my neck of the woods, I think the Spray Lakes operations are in full flight in Cochrane. Holy cow, they look like they're awfully busy up there. 12,000 Indigenous people work in the sector. 1,400 Indigenous-owned forestry businesses. Like that, maybe we can just, before we leave that, let's talk about the issue of the Indigenous businesses, because I think that you would have seen this as well, Jeff, in British Columbia. It was actually an Indigenous forestry company that was pushing back against the environmentalists that were trying to shut them down as well. What's your partnership like with the Indigenous communities?
Oh, well, I think we're starting to really look at that as the future of our industry. Not only as the British Columbia government's, they're part of their mandate is, and it's not going to be an easy transition, but part of the reconciliation of our relationship with First Nations is that the forest industry, I believe, is going to lead that pack in terms of a lot of the annual alba cut. They're going to be in control, no different than Northern Saskatchewan, as Derek mentioned earlier. They're going to be in control of a lot of the annual alba cut on a go forward basis. And I look to our local 1-11937 out of Vancouver Island and BC's coast that has a groundbreaking agreement with the Huayat out of TFL 44 in Port Alberni, in terms of ensuring that 50% of the jobs, of the union jobs, will be First Nations for the Huayat peoples, and things like that. So groundbreaking, agreements and approaches to ensure that that we can provide, or that this industry can provide, good family, nation supporting jobs to their peoples, and maybe change a bit of the terrible narrative that's gone on for the last couple of centuries.
No kidding. Is that happening across the country? I know BC seems to be so far ahead and seeing some really proactive and progressive Indigenous leaders developing a whole range of different business interests. Is that a story that we're seeing play out the rest of the country?
Yeah, it's really exciting. I think we have a couple barriers. So I think number one, Indigenous communities are not homogenous communities where everybody agrees. It's no different than any other community or neighborhood association. I mean, there's different opinions in every community, and I think this sense, and we see this from some of these activist groups trying to suggest that paint Indigenous communities and peoples with one brush. And far be it from me, I'm not Indigenous, so I'm not going to speak for Indigenous or Métis people. And that's why I think it's up to local community discussions. When I took this job 5 years ago, one of the first things, we work closely with Assembly of First Nations on policy, Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, Indigenous Resource Network, a number of national groups that have broader mandates. I had a dream of, can we launch some kind of, listen, we make lumber and we live in or adjacent to Indigenous communities across the country. Can we do a national housing program? Can we not do more here? And then I started to appreciate that it's very difficult because local matters, and different communities have different values and interests and leadership structures. And I think as we look to seize the opportunity of advancing reconciliation and providing more opportunity for these communities, what they want, what those communities want and value matters. And I see this across our membership, because in some communities, they want the community wants to just plant trees. In another community, they might want to run the log yard. In another community, they might just want revenue sharing. It's so it really becomes important, I think, not to generalize and try to, and I know our companies on the ground have those conversations. Two of the barriers we got to overcome to be better and to do more. Number one, capacity building. Some of these communities don't have the capacity to respond to a request for information. Like they might just not be resourced. So how do we empower them and activate them and support them according to their wishes? Or, and in some cases, it's just straight up capital. How can they get a log truck? How can they build a sawmill? So I think we got a lot of work to do there for sure. But I also think we need to respect that dialogue needs to be local, and it also needs to respect and consider the values of that local community.
All right, let me ask about another one. I think we've talked about most of the key principles because we've got job sustainable projects for Canada and the world. We've talked about ecosystem management and conservation. Maybe there's more to say on that. Local input and collaboration. But I like this line as well that you've got here about keeping forest as forest forever. The reason why I like that is because I think a lot of people misunderstand some of the forestry practices that you have, in particular clear cutting. I think there's the notion that what we're seeing today is what it's going to look like forever. And it's hard for us to think in terms of timescales of forests growing over 160 years or managing forests over 100 or 200 years. We're also used to the 4-year election cycle. Or the 5-second thing that's trending on in a hashtag on Twitter. Having that long view is really kind of alien to our thinking right now. But let me go to Jeff just so that I understand what does that mean when you're working in an industry that has a 200-year time horizon? How does that affect the way you look at the industry in the long term?
It means that the attention span is short enough as it is. So good luck if we're going to try and keep everybody thinking that far out. I agree. It's a huge barrier, right? And people will think, and you're right. I've flown over BC I live in Cranbrook, so I fly to Vancouver all the time. So we see the clear cuts, and people go, I said, yeah, but it's doing all these good things. And and I go through my spiel when I'm talking to people on a plane, or when I did before that started. But at any rate, people need to understand that the process. I mean, clear cut is still the most economical, and I think in the most environmentally conducive way to harvest in our industry. I mean, there's just not out of the way. I mean, you can talk about select cut and thinning and stuff with it, but it's just not it's not economical on a grand scale. So but it provides other advantages that people don't talk about either. It provides other advantages in terms of for wildlife and for overall growth in terms of, and if there's a beetle infestation or some sort of insect it does provide that barrier so that nature can take its course, right? Or stop taking its course, I guess, and regrow. So there's so many positives of people, just their initial response is what they see, rather than digging deep and reading between the lines of what the benefits are and why the industry does what they do.
It's Derek, it strikes me that we should be able to make a carbon capture case on that. I mean, when you see trees being harvested, it means that you've locked in that carbon, and you're going to be putting it into the walls of somebody's home or a deck or a fence. And then you're going to be replanting, and it's the new growth of the trees that are going to be doing the work of collecting the carbon emissions. So we should be able to make this argument. And why is it so difficult?
Yeah, well, I want us to go back to clear cut. I think we need to reclaim the term clear cut. It is turned into an emotive term that sounds like we're just mowing down trees for fun. And I'm going to geek out on you a little bit here, but like in our business, we talk about emulating natural disturbances. Okay. So the boreal forest is a fire-prone landscape. Fires rip through, depending on where you are, 80, 100, 120 years. And when you talked about that 200-year time horizon, it's across the country. In Alberta, it's about 200 years the planning is done for. In other parts, it's 100, 120 years. But in that 100 to 200 year, like, you tell me another business that's planning on the land base in 100 to 200 year cycles. I'm not sure if I can think of one. But anyway, the point being, as part of that multiple values, local input, biodiversity, where's the bear's den, where are the moose having their babies, at what time of the year, where are the heron rooks. There's also a consideration of what was the historical fire or wind pattern through this area. Like all that data and information goes into this. And the clear cut, and this group in the US used a picture of a clear cut in one of their blogs. And I sent it to my our chief forester here, and he kind of redlined it for me, saying, okay, this is a clear cut. Yeah. So these trees were left here for wildlife purposes. This is a protected area around a watershed. Like, I actually wish we would have published it, because we had just done it kind of in the office as a bit of information sharing to kind of get to the bottom of the latest blog. But the clear cut term has that emotive, there's a nasty emotive term associated with that. And I think we need, as an industry, need to be bolder about talking about why it's okay to cut a tree down. What is a clear cut and why is it important? So to me, there's a significant environmental and landscape benefit to doing that. And I think we need to reclaim that. And I think we need to do more work, as you said, in terms of the carbon story of the built environment, and also step back and think, if not from Canada, from where? What are we going to build with if you don't want to use Canadian wood? You want to get it from Russia? Do you want to use a more carbon intensive material? Because and I think we need to challenge ourselves to start having more fulsome conversations about these things than these kind of one-off blogs.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. And in fact, Louise is at the bottom here saying, how I wish the oil and gas had representation like these gentlemen 15 years ago. Would have been such great ideas, and we might have gone in a different direction. But part of the other reason I wanted to talk to both of you was to see, I think if we could have done it again on some of these campaigns that have been targeting our industry, we probably would want to replicate what the two of you are doing right now. So I want to make sure that people know the way in which they can assist you in trying to change this campaign in the US. Because what I worry about is bad ideas. They're like a virus. They have a way of catching on too. And so if California and New York end up getting these bills passed, who's to say that they're not going to use it for protectionist reasons? That's the other part of it, right? There are interests in the US that might like it if they didn't have to face competition from Canadian forestry products. And so I'm wanting to know, Jeff, from your perspective, let's start there. What is it that, tell us a little bit more about the campaign for pushing back, and what do you think that we need to do to be able to be aware of it and also to assist?
The standard answer in terms from a Canadian's standpoint is to always make sure you're engaged to your political your representative on whatever level, be it your provincial and or federal, and ensure that that hey, some of this legislation on state sides going to have an impact, could have an impact on it. From being in part of an international union, one of the advantages is that when we do things of this, and I don't know if I've talked to Derek about this or not, I agreed from my standpoint to do this, and all of a sudden I had another portion of my union down in this. This one was at a District 4 in New York and New Jersey through Pittsburgh, and saying, what's going on here? We got a call from the American Federation of Labor saying that the steelworkers. So I didn't communicate, because you think it silos lots with Canada, but then my union, I explained the same situation for my union and my brothers and sisters down in the States there, and how this can impact our workers in our industry in Canada. And they got on board and said, well, wait a minute, it's misinformation, and then this bill is misguided. And so from their standpoint, they got on board and are certainly helping us push back against this bill in both California, District 12, the steelworkers, and District 4, and out in New York and New Jersey, and push back on this legislation, because it has an impact on us as a greater union than the workers, the members of that union.
Thanks for giving us that context. It would be nice if we could find more of these campaigns where there could be that kind of collaboration. So Derek, let me ask you, do you have some, I think you have some specific asks about it. I don't even know if this legislation, if it can be modified, or if you think it just shouldn't pass altogether. Maybe you can tell us what the legislative process is at right now.
Yeah, I think I'd start by saying I hope the bill is not defeated, or I hope the bill is modified, because if the bill is defeated, the cloud's going to hang, and it'll go to Massachusetts or Oregon next. I would rather see the bill clearly modified to either remove reference to the boreal, because my counterparts in Finland and Sweden are scratching their head like I am, or recognize the third-party certified products coming out of Canadian forests, of which all of our members are certified to. I think it's very simple. We've sat down. Listen, we've sat down with the NGOs pushing this. We've walked them through. We've walked the sponsoring legislators in California and New York through. I think the way people who are interested, and once again, we want to maintain a collaborative, positive dialogue, and we went to great pains to talk about doing this pushback, because I hate like heck to give stuff credibility that doesn't deserve credibility. But to not do something in this is to create a vacuum and allow the perception to become reality. We've got to stand up. And as Jeff said, I was thrilled to see New York and New Jersey unions come on board to support us in New York State. I'm thrilled to see California home builders and a couple of anti-poverty groups come up, because they know this hurts housing prices for them. So I think we're seeing, so for us, respectful dialogue. We're, Mary Ng, who's our international trade minister, who's been, very supportive of Canadian forestry. We're encouraging her to step up and do what she can through diplomatic channels, and continuing to, and any Canadians who are interested, we of course welcome, a friendly email to Assembly Member Kalra in Sacramento, and Senator Liz Kruger, who represents the east side of Manhattan in New York City. Just send them a letter and let them know, if you have experience in the sector, what we do here in Canada and how proud we are of it.
Is there anything our politicians need to do? Or, I've noticed is it seems like on a lot of the issues that have impacted Canadian industry, it almost seems like there's more activism on the American side of the border. I'm thinking with Keystone XL, you've got all these attorneys general who are trying to overturn that decision. You've got the American Chamber of Commerce that weighed in on the Line 5 debate on Enbridge's side. And I'm wondering if, generally speaking, we're just a little too passive in Canada, and if there's something more Canadians should do, or any Canadian organization should get involved.
From my point of view, go ahead, Derek, if you want.
No, I was just going to say, I flip it around. Can you imagine if Doug Ford or Jason Kenney did what Gretchen Whitmer's doing in Michigan? Can you imagine if a member of any provincial caucus or any provincial caucus try to impose a procurement ban on stuff coming from Ohio or California or New York? Like, this is what I've been saying to some decision makers. Like, we've got Line 5, which we've got, for many reasons, we haven't had the vaccine production capacity in Canada. Can we not take a moment to think about, and we're small, we need to be a trading nation. This is not about absolute protectionism, but I think it should be about looking at where are our strengths, what can we build off of? But I just go back to thinking, can you imagine if a provincial MNA or MLA or MPP did this, and what kind of a response do you think we'd be getting from the White House and stateside? I think it'd be pretty severe. Exactly,
and that's why I wonder about the passivity. Jeff, do you see the same thing? Is there more that we need to do?
I hasten to go down the Canadians are too nice road, but Derek's right in terms of what's the old saying, when America catches the cold, the economic cold, we get the flu. I mean, they're a massive nation. They're 10 times our size. They're our largest trading partner. I mean, it's. And you mentioned the situation in terms of Keystone, and from a grassroots groundswell discussion, we're person on the street talking about it. It was, people were pissed. I'm going to say it. They're pissed off. They were choked and not happy about what the impact that's going to have on our industry, and not our industry, but the economy as a whole out in Western Canada. And you hear that groundswell, but it's almost like we turn on ourselves a little bit sometimes, rather than point it to where that protest needs to be in terms of down south. We need to keep doing what we're doing in terms of, well, I wish more people would do it in terms of contact and making sure that their elected officials are aware of what the impact is, and if you have contacts in the States, making sure they can help us. I mean, it's sometimes we do not stand up enough for ourselves in that regard, and I guess it's to our own detriment. But it's unfortunate that we are where we live, or where we are on the map, and we have all these great natural resources, this great wealth of natural resources, and we have this great trading party partnered in this to the south of us that sometimes isn't always great. I mean, forest industry, trade wars, we know it well.
Okay.
Well, Jeff, I know that you have another obligation at 2 o'clock today, so we'll wrap it up here. But I wonder if there's some constructive advice you can give to people about how to follow you and how to engage. As you probably know, like I'm so dismayed by what I see on Facebook and Twitter. I tend to use LinkedIn, and I've got another social media channel on locals. We're trying out YouTube here, but I wonder if should we be engaging in those mediums as a way of pushing the message forward? Is that where you're communicating with people to keep them aware of what's going on, or is there a better way to follow what your work on this file?
We use all of the channels, and I'll be honest, and a lot of our members, my members, and use like Facebook is probably the number one ability to communicate, and it's a matter of getting the right message out there. Just because there's just such a mass amount of people on it in terms of a lot of our members are they are on it. But it's an opportunity. We just take advantage of it. I mean, it has its pitfalls, no question, and it can go in 15 different directions, unfortunately. But we need to, as an industry, I think we need to sell ourselves. We talk about that urban and rural divide, and I think to the urbanite, I think that they need to understand where their products come from, where their toiletry products come from, where the masks come from, where the boxes that they get from the Amazon when they get their stuff shipped in it, where it comes from. You know, we need to do a better job of making sure that we are a sustainable industry, and we don't just mow down trees and you know the economy be down, or the environment be down. It's not what we do, and I think we just got to keep sending that message and repeating it. And I don't think it's a constant fight.
Well, I'm glad that you're willing to take it on. Let me put the same question to you, Derek. I got the press release from Kelly, and keep them coming if you do more collaborations like this, so that I can keep up to speed. And I'll make sure that we try to do this kind of thing again. But how do you think is the best way for people to follow your campaign, and also to engage in helping with that education campaign?
Yeah, for information through our social media, of course, is the best way. I think we also, we do frequent public opinion polling to understand where are Canadians at. Canadians love forestry. The biggest issue that we have is those who don't have an opinion about us because they just don't know us. Like the positives far outweigh the negatives, which is why spending too much time on Facebook and Twitter can be not only bad for your mental health, but it can also warp your sense of reality, right? So we know Canadians are with us. We just are dealing with a very noisy, small, very well organized group, and these issues don't begin and end in these state legislatures. They're going to be going to the customers, and this is part of a longer play. So we just need to keep reaching out smartly and trying to reach some of those non-traditional audiences. We're a group that's pretty good at talking to ourselves, and we got to think about better ways to punch through.
Well, thank you both for talking to me today. It's been an excellent discussion. I sure appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Yeah, my pleasure. That's Derek Nybor, who is the president of the Forest Products Association of Canada, and Jeff Bromley with the United Steelworkers Wood Council. Once again, I am Danielle Smith. I'm the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. We'll do these from time to time, and that's it for us for today. So you can follow us at albertaenterprisegroup.com, and take it easy. We'll see you again.